All right, we are all here. Our guest is here, which is a big relief for us. Thank you, Leilani, for being here tonight with us. Thanks everyone for being here tonight. Tonight, because I'm in the Netherlands, but I'm sure you are all over the world, and good afternoon, good morning for you all. We are going to start, and I'll leave the floor now to Caroline.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. I'm going to share my screen. It wants to share. Yes. Okay, so again, welcome everyone. And indeed, from wherever in the world you are. So I'm Caroline Newton. I'm from the TU Delft University of Technology, which is located in the beautiful city of Delft. But I'm speaking to you from Mechelen, where I live, and that's a city in Belgium. Welcome to our Urban Thinkers campus, which is specifically looking at how we can produce a call for a manifesto for the just city. And so we are extremely glad to have you here today, and happy that many of you also decided to participate in making this manifesto for a just city. Because we are living extraordinary times, and we need new and better visions for cities and communities that are just, inclusive, and sustainable. In fact, we are living through a huge shock to many of our current systems that are political, economic, environmental, social, and so on. But next to living this shock, I think it also gives us the opportunity to think about new alternatives and new pathways. And we here together are a team of students and teachers from the TU Delft Global Urban Lab, which is a TU Delft platform to discuss issues of urbanization in the Global South. We are also supported by the Delft Global Initiative and the Spatial Justice Network. Now, the event is organized in a partnership with the World Urban Campaign, which is the UN Habitat platform in charge of promoting the implementation of the new urban agenda that was launched in 2016 in Quito in Ecuador. The website of the World Urban Campaign is in the chat box, and it's also there on the slides. On the website, you can find a complete overview of all the
Excuse me, Caroline?
Yes.
We cannot see your slides, yeah.
Okay.
So we see a black screen.
Yes.
You have seen none of the slides? So.
No.
Okay. I'll try to solve this. Is it working now?
No.
No, we just see a black screen.
Share her slides.
I stopped my share. So.
Yeah, I can share my slides. Just bear with me one moment.
Please go on, Caroline.
So on the website of the World Urban Campaign, you can find a big overview of all the different Urban Thinkers campuses that are being organized. And these are instrumental platforms for stakeholders to get together to make decisions about implementing the new urban agenda.
Please go on, Caroline.
Today, we have a very special guest, Leilani Farha, who is a Canadian lawyer and the global director of The Shifts, a housing initiative. And between June 2014 and April 2020, she was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing. But before we hear from Leilani, let me give the word to Maarten van Ham, the director of the Department of Urbanism of our faculty. And he will share a few words of welcome. So Maarten, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay. Well, a warm welcome to all of you from Delft University of Technology. I'm the head of the Department of Urbanism, which is one of the 4 departments in our faculty of architecture. And I'm also a professor of urban geography, and I specialize in better understanding spatial inequalities and segregation. So for me, this seminar series is really interesting. I understood that this Build Back Better seminar is part of a series of seminars of 4, which is again a part of this wider program that you're running. Personally, my interest in this seminar really comes from the work that I've been doing on the changing urban geography of cities. And I've just finished a book. I'm not here to promote my book because we're not making any money of it, but I'll share a link later because we're going to publish a completely free book. You don't have to pay for it. And in this book, we looked at 24 case study cities all over the world. And we for each of these cities, we studied how over the last 10, 20, 30 years, patterns of socioeconomic segregation have been changing. And we were really quite astonished about how comparable all the cases were. So we found that in almost all of these cities, all over the world, I mean, really all over the world, from Jakarta to Canadian city, American cities, Lima, South America, Johannesburg, I mean, Europe, almost everywhere, we found that spatial inequalities are increasing, that socioeconomic segregation is increasing. So the rich and the poor are increasingly living in different parts of the city. And we found a very strong general pattern of the urban rich. And when I talk rich, I don't mean the really wealthy people, but the people that earn much better salaries than others. The well-off people, they increasingly want to live in the urban centers, while poverty all over the world is suburbanizing. So cities are turning more or less inside out. And this research was actually inspired by work on Toronto by David Hilchansky. I don't know whether you know him, Leilani. Yeah, Hilchansky, great guy, but also a great academic. And he was one of the first to note that, that in Toronto, the city was turning inside out, where in the 70s, the center was really poor and the well-off were moving to the suburbs. And in the more recent decades, this pattern has reversed, where the well-off are moving to the city center and poverty is suburbanizing. Well, is this a problem? Yes, I think so, for many reasons. And I think that's why this seminar series is so important. This is a problem because of this sort of turning inside out of cities. This really affects the likelihood of people from different socioeconomic groups of meeting each other. It has an effect on housing. If poverty is pushed to the outside of cities, that means that they will need cars or public transport to get to places where there are jobs, and often public transport isn't good and people do not have access to cars. It has an effect on the opportunities children have to have a good education. It relates to health. It relates to all kinds of sustainability issues. And especially, and I think to the right, to housing, not just housing itself, but also the location of housing, because the two are really strongly intertwined. So these challenges, these changes in our cities lead to a lot of challenges and a lot of questions regarding the futures of our cities and about the social sustainability of cities. And I think this Urban Thinkers Campus will not provide all the answers to all the questions that you might have, but I think it's a really important starting point for discussions about solutions. And I'm really impressed that, I mean, the last time I looked, I can't see it on my screen anymore, there were more than 200 people now joining this seminar, which showed great interest in this topic. So, as Caroline already said, we have a speaker today, the keynote speaker, Leilani Farha, a Canadian lawyer, and you have been the special rapporteur for the United Nations up to 2020. And in preparation for this seminar, I was just listening to some of your more recent podcasts. And I think you open them by saying that you're actually, well, I wouldn't say glad not to be the special rapporteur anymore, but you have more freedom now, which I suppose is a good thing. Freedom to do lots of other things. And you're now the global director of the Shift, and I'm sure you're very busy doing lots of new initiatives, but on top of that, you're having this, I think, weekly podcast with the director of the film Push, in which you feature quite prominently. So thank you very much for being our guest speaker today, and I wish you all a very stimulating event.
Okay, thank you very much, Maarten. So the organizers of these events of tonight include Anja van der Wat, Gabriel Caradona, Ganesh Babu, Jonathan Sebendran, Lucas Gioia, Natalia Teles, Luz Maria Vergara, Igor Temples Pessoa, Roberto Rocco, and myself. And the idea is that by organizing and participating in these kind of activities, we can extend the mutual learning much beyond the classroom. And I'd like to give now the word to the TU Delft students involved in the organization of these events. You're muted, Anja.
There we go. Apologies for that.
No worries.
Hello, hi. A warm welcome to the Manifesto for the Just City from the TU Delft students. My name is Anja. I'm the student assistant at the Global Urban Lab, which is the think tank that has played a part in organising this tonight. Along with the Global Urban Lab team, the TU Delft master students Gabriele, Natalia, Ganesh, and Jonathan have pushed to make this happen. 2 decades ago, Ed Social referred to the state of affairs in the field of urbanism as both the best and the worst of times to be studying cities. While there is so much that is new and challenging to respond to, there is much less agreement than ever before on the best way to practically and theoretically make sense of the new urban worlds being created. We believe that this workshop series is an extremely valuable way of connecting with students from around the world, as well as collaborating with people from varied backgrounds and disciplines. The opportunity to exchange ideas and expand our knowledge will be fruitful for all and will provide us with a chance to have a better understanding of the global issues at hand. The UTC is a unique opportunity to gain knowledge about current matters that are present in cities around the world. What are the causes of both the visible and invisible inequalities of our cities? And more importantly, how can we tackle these as emerging urban practitioners? Furthermore, we're excited to hear ideas and thoughts from other students who are joining us from continents around the world, which is amazing. In these times of political and societal unrest, it is important to strengthen solidarity amongst us, to push forward our agendas towards building a more just and egalitarian society. We really hope this workshop will be a nice way to promote collaboration across different disciplines of study, but also across universities to break the silos that we are currently in. So yeah, a warm welcome from us, and yeah, looking forward to the lecture and the workshop after.
Okay, thank you, Anja. Hi, welcome all. My name is Luz, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at TU Delft, and this is our third Urban Thinker campus, UTC. The first TU Delft UTC was organized in 2017 and was titled Education for the City We Need. There we explore how to discuss and teach the new urban agenda. You can find the link for the report in the chat. And the second UTC was this year and addresses responses to the COVID pandemic in cities around the world, how to build back better via the new Green Deal, and housing in Africa. And we are right now preparing the report on that event. But without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our speaker, Leilani Farha, who speaks to us from Canada. And as we already said, Leilani was UN Special Rapporteur for the Right of Housing and is now Director of SHIFT, which is a large NGO that fights and promotes the right to dignified housing. She will talk more about Chief, but it is important to highlight that the Chief recognizes housing as a human right, not a commodity or an extractive industry. The Chief restored the understanding of housing as home, challenging the ways financial actors undermine the right to housing. Using a human rights framework, the Chief provokes an action to end homelessness, unaffordability, and evictions globally. The link to the Chief is again on the chat. Well, thank you all for being here, and the floor is yours, Leilani.
Thank you so much, Luz, Roberto, Martin, for such a warm welcome and greeting. I'm really super happy to be here. And I note in particular that there are lots of young people on the Zoom call. From what I can tell, none of you look wrinkled and tired like me, which suggests you're much younger than me. And I really am so pleased because I feel the topic that we're talking about today is one that is so very important to the future of young people. And I actually think it's one of the issues of the day that we should all be seized with and talking about. So very happy that this convening is happening and that I was invited to join you. Martin, I have to say, I cannot wait for your book to come out. So thank you for giving me a heads up about that. It looks amazing. Professor Hulchansky is a friend, a colleague, and of course I admire his work very much and have relied on it throughout my own work. So I think your book is timely, and to be tracking this as a global pattern is exactly what we need. And is very much where I've been coming from on this issue, and why, in fact, I started the shift. Because we do have before us a global housing crisis that does require global responses, in my opinion. It needs local responses too, and city-based responses, but certainly we need to also view this as a global phenomenon. I guess where I wanted to start my comments is by just, posing the question, who are cities for? Who are they for? Are they for rich people? Are they for financial actors? Are they for professionals? Are they for a broader ambit of people? Are they in fact for everyone? And I guess where I land is that I think they are for everyone and must be for everyone. As Martin said, cities are often where the jobs are. People go where they can survive, where they can find a livelihood to survive. Now we're understanding that accessing affordable housing is so much part of finding a livelihood, that you can have a job, but if you can't find affordable housing, that job ends up being meaningless to you. And I think cities are for everyone because we need a mix of people for cities to run. That's just so obvious. You can't have just a city that's with investors and rich people because, and this is not how I view cities, but from their point of view, they require services. Rich people like their expensive coffees. They like having household help. They like going to shops and having shopkeepers. They even like to avail themselves of informal markets on occasion. And so obviously those jobs need to be populated and people need to live in cities to have those jobs. But then there is, of course, a more vision-oriented reason that we want cities to be for everyone. Because that's what gives life to a city. That's what gives it its diversity. The pulse of a city, the grittiness, is to have a complete mix and jumble of people. If any of you who have walked the streets of cities, you'll know that while you may feel uncomfortable in some moments in a city, it is what gives it gives a city a vibe, is when you have even some friction and tensions between people. To me, these are all actually very healthy things. This is what creates energy in a place. I say that if we continue on the unsustainable path we're on, cities are going to start resembling the most awful places in the world. Airports, right? Generic store after generic store, a kind of lack of emotionality in the room, sterile quality, what city am I in? Could be anywhere, because there's Louis Vuitton and there's H&M and there's Starbucks. So I think it is clear that we are on an unsustainable path, and Martin and Luz already alluded to that. And I think COVID-19 as a pandemic only exposed the unsustainable path that we're on. It only exposed the housing crisis that predates the pandemic and that is thriving in the midst of the pandemic. So what are the marks or hallmarks or characteristics of the housing crisis, both before the pandemic and certainly in the middle of the pandemic? Well, number one is, well, maybe not number one. I'm not going to rank them, because all of these are competing strains on housing systems. But we know that we have an affordability problem in most cities, global north and global south. And in fact, I like to draw. Normally we would be together and I would have perhaps a board behind me, but I'll draw it here in my notebook and then I'll show it to you. So this is basically, I hope you can see, I only have an orange pen. Orange is not a good color, but maybe you can see. I don't know, can you see? What I'm showing you anyway is a simple graph. So you've got a 90-degree angle here, that's your graph. And then you've got this line going off this way. That line is wages. Oh, someone's saying I can't see. Well, here, I'll draw it with my hands. You've got a graph and you've got a line that goes a bit like this, a little bit up, just a little bit, or it stays pretty like this. That's wages over time. Wages are stagnant, stasis, we might say. And then you have a line that goes like this, and it's arching up, 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 up. It's not the pandemic line, although it could be. That line is the cost of housing over time. And that gap is human suffering. That gap is the violation of the right to housing. That gap is housing precarity. That gap is the risk of eviction. And that's what we're concerned about in terms of the unsustainability of housing in cities. So you move to a city because that's where the employment is, and you get a job that should be, you know, a decent wage, whether it's working as a cleaner or whether it's working in tech industry. And suddenly you find that you actually can't afford to take the job because you can't afford to live in that city. Now, part of that is wages having stagnated, but part of that is the escalation of the cost of housing. And that escalation is so steep. And that line that I drew is actually worse in cities in developing countries than it is in some of the developed countries. You know, so that line would look like Lagos, you know, Cairo. It's pretty interesting. What we're also seeing in cities around the world, beyond unaffordability, is very weak tenant protections. Well, there's two things. So because housing's so expensive, you have the growth of informal settlements across the global south. They're just increasing and increasing. And that is housing precarity, and that is inadequate housing, often without basic services and often at risk of eviction, because informal settlements often situate themselves on public lands, and governments often seek to evict people living in informal settlements. Why? Because they want to develop that land for investors and for people with more money. Often informal settlements are situated on some of the best lands because people need to live near where they're working, near city amenities, near their own communities. And so they will establish themselves on some of the best lands, and governments will evict them. And that's obviously a many-layered problem. But we're also seeing in both developed and developing countries very weak tenant protections, where tenants have no security of tenure. They're not granted, let's say, long-term leases, or rents can be increased quite dramatically from one year to the next, sometimes even from 1 month to the next, depending on the legislative regime. And weak tenant protections can, of course, lead to evictions, and evictions often lead to homelessness. And that's another thing that we're seeing in cities around the world, an increase in most cities around the world, an increase in the number of people living in homelessness. And if we just pause for a moment there and think about that, so what we're seeing is increasing wealth in cities that Martin's book is going to expose. So we're seeing, you know, a lot more wealth congregating in cities, a lot more wealthy people congregating in cities, and at the same time, increasing homelessness. Now that should make you scratch your head, like, what? More wealth, more homelessness? And then the penny should drop. Perhaps with wealth comes homelessness. With wealth in real estate comes homelessness. And what's so disturbing to me, if we pause and also ask ourselves again, who are cities for? When we're looking at who's being driven out. Once you reach a state of homelessness in many cities around the world, what happens next is you start getting pushed out of the city. Now, Martin's book is going to demonstrate that it's not even just those who are homeless, right? It's those who are lower income. You're getting pushed to the suburbs. I'm only talking about a subcategory of people who are homeless. But I would obviously, Martin's research is going to be super important for us to document this. So the lower your income is, and certainly people living in homelessness being pushed out of cities. And so again, who are cities for? And if you look at the phenomenon of migration and refugees, this is a particularly acute problem for those of you live. It's not a problem, it's how migration and migrants and refugees are dealt with is the problem. But those of you situated in Europe will know. Obviously, an influx of migrants and refugees does put pressure on housing systems, but the response has been to provide such scant housing services, et cetera, for those populations, so as to, in fact, make it hostile territory for those groups to actually reside in cities, moving them along from city to city until they go where? Who knows? So I guess what I want to say from here is, I've been asked many times, and I think it's a good question for us to dwell in. It's like, well, if they can't afford to live in cities, do they have the right to live in the city? I'm asked this all the time. And I mean, I find it actually a slightly problematic question. I mean, so how does that work? We create cities that are unaffordable to people, and then we suggest that they don't have a right to live there. Obviously problematic. But I will say, from a law point of view, from an international human rights law point of view, you will not find in a treaty the right to live in a city. You will see some political declarations, the urban agenda, for example, the habitat agenda, the new urban agenda, excuse me, sorry. You will see references to the right to the city. But in terms of treaties that governments sign and ratify, you will not see a codified right to the city. But what you will see is the right to an adequate standard of living, which includes access to adequate housing. And in fact, the right to housing stands as its own separate right. And so if we all agree and know that the reason there are pressures on cities, that so many people who in quotes can't afford to live in cities are in cities, is because that's where they can have a reasonable expectation of having an adequate standard of living, in other words, through employment, then we know that yes, there is a kind of right to the city through international human rights law. And importantly, there is a right to adequate housing. And governments have committed to that very clearly. So, you know, what does that look like? What does that actually mean when governments commit to the right to housing? And I just want to reiterate that in my opinion, by committing to the right to housing, governments can commit at the same time to ensuring that cities are for everyone. And that's what I love about a human rights framework, is it addresses inequality and structural inequality, and it addresses structural discrimination. And so if we can get cities and national level governments to embrace the right to housing, they will be embracing the notion that the city is for everyone. So what are the principles? What would be the key principles that governments should ascribe to, and how should they do this? So first of all, I would say it's very important for cities to, and this is just a really practical thing I want to put out there, but it's sometimes nice to know that human rights are not airy-fairy, and that they actually have some practical sense, you know, practical applicability. And so what I want to say is that cities and national level governments should actually do two things. They should put in legislation that they commit themselves to recognizing housing is a fundamental human right. They don't have to say, and not a commodity. They could just say, you know, the city of so-and-so hereby declares or hereby recognizes that housing is a fundamental human right. A national government could do the same thing. It doesn't have to be in the Constitution. It could just be a piece of legislation. That's super important. And that legislation should then say that it is the responsibility of the government to enact a human rights-based housing strategy, really a concrete strategy for how the human right to housing is going to roll out, that includes measurable goals and timelines, that includes principles of non-discrimination and inclusivity and diversity, that includes an understanding of affordability, and that includes methods to ensure that there is housing that is affordable to households, and that affordability not be based on what markets can bear, but rather it be based on what households can afford, you know, what the money households have. A housing strategy would address issues around security of tenure and weak tenant protections. It could also control the big financial actors that have moved in to the housing landscape. And I should have mentioned this earlier, one of the causes of unaffordability of housing. For those of you who have seen the film Push, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't, you should, because it'll enlighten you and it's entertaining at the same time. But you know, private equity firms have moved into cities around the world and are purchasing residential real estate and forcing the price of housing to go up. And so through a rights-based housing strategy and through legislation, you could be controlling these financial actors to make sure they don't upset the housing system in such a way as to make cities unaffordable to everyday people. And it's super important as well for governments to start recognizing that people, tenants, residents of informal settlements have a very, if granted the space and place to contribute to cities and to contribute to what a city could look like, they will take it up. I have never been in a city where opportunities were offered for people to engage in city planning, in housing affordability issues, etc., where residents said, no, not interested. It's the opposite. What you find is when people, when tenants, when residents of informal settlements are engaged on issues of their future, of the future of the city, of their lands, they will sit at the table and they will come up with very practical and often very modest ideas for how to make their own lives better and the city better as a result. I'm going to stop there. I think I've given you a lot to think about. I hope I have anyway. And I'm open to questions if that's how, Roberto, you want to proceed. Or Martin, sorry.
Thank you so much. So I think, thank you so much, Leilani. It's really anticlimactic not to have the applause at the end, but thank you. We will have time now for questions from the audience. But since I'm here, I have my first question, if you allow me. What do you think about the idea of making housing, or at least some public social housing, a public infrastructure that has a different way of financing? Have you heard of this?
I have. There's actually a fair bit of discussion around this. And I think that makes good sense. And it certainly seems much easier to access dollars for infrastructure and public infrastructure than it does to access dollars for public housing. The question will always be about management. So let's say you could put housing within a public infrastructure umbrella, or under that umbrella, like bridges and subway lines and metro and, you know, the bike lanes and all of this. Let's say housing could be put in that frame. The question would be who would build it, who would manage it, etc. And I think we need to disrupt the current thinking around that. Some might say, well, only the private sector is capable of building. And I would dispute that. And then some might say, oh, it should just rest with government. My feeling is it's really important for cities and national level governments to increase public assets. So to actually do the purchasing of lands or to retain their own lands, but that it's very important to work with community associations, community housing providers in the development of those lands and those housing projects.
Sorry, I muted myself. Indeed, and I think a lot of it has to do with how governments see their own role in each country, right? I think we have all these extremes where we have states that are more, they care for their citizens, and states that are more absent. And so we have this variety, and luckily we are here represented. A lot of countries are represented in this room. So I would like to hear from you guys. So what are questions for Leilani? Also from the organization, Martin, Russ, whoever wants to ask a question.
I have a question, if possible.
Of course, go on. You can also go on, Cristobal.
Thank you. I would like to go to ask, what do we do in countries like in different countries of Latin America, where hoarding processes and speculation and financialization processes are developed at a point that are totally sponsored and supported by the state. And also we have ruling classes that are based on the property of urban and rural land. It seems that fighting those forces inevitably leads to a structural political fight, because on the legal territory, it's very little what we can do to keep innovating over the status quo.
A very tough question and a super relevant question. And it is one of the, it's tricky. It's tricky in so many ways, even where financialization is not directly, or speculation is not directly state sponsored. Most economies have a complete integration of real estate its speculative nature, and it's like totally connected. So when we start, I always make it sound super easy. Let's legislate the right to housing and say, oh, housing is a human right and not a commodity, you know? And I try to make it sound like super light. Oh yeah, no problem. But it is true, like if you really start looking at it, what we're suggesting is a disruption of economies, actually. And so the question, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name, Cristobal, it's a super intense area to be working on, because governments are so wedded to this, so promoting speculation. Where I saw it, and I don't know what example you were thinking of, Cristobal, but I saw it up close in Egypt, for example, where the housing program that Egypt was really very proud of was actually very much part of the state, and it was mortgage-based system. And in fact, it was a way to generate money for state banks and state coffers, state accounts, off of the backs of some of the least wealthy people in the country. And what was happening was, in fact, speculation. So wealthier people were buying up numbers and numbers and numbers of units, making fewer units available for those with less income, but propping up a government system and government banks and the economy of the country. And so to dismantle that is difficult. I think the starting point is to have housing recognized as a human right. And then from there, every policy and program related to housing or housing finance should be run through a human rights. I call it not a lens. I prefer to think of it as a sieve or colander, you know, like when you make pasta and you throw the pasta in, the water goes through and the pasta sticks. So I like to think of human rights that way. So you have a human rights colander, and you put in your policies, whether it's a finance policy, taxation policy, or a housing policy or law, you pour it through, and what sticks are the things that are human rights friendly, and the things that drip through are not human rights friendly. And so if we start setting up human rights apparatus to play that role, then we might start being able to chip away at the programs, policies, and laws that are put in place, whether they're finance or housing specific, that contribute to speculation. I just want to say something. I found out, for example, just to show you how integrated housing is with economies. This is just one teeny statistic, but I found out the other day, I was just doing some research for a conversation I'm having tomorrow, that in Canada, 7% of our GDP, 7%, that's actually quite a bit, okay, of our GDP is related to fees associated with real estate transactions. So 7%. So then you start looking, okay, well, what percentage of Canada's GDP is related to real estate itself, and et cetera? And it starts inching up to 18-20%. Right. So if we're going to meddle in this area, we have to be super conscious that we are meddling in an area that is fundamental to the economies of the nations that we're engaged in. So, yeah, but I still try to make it seem cheery and light.
Leilani, if you allow me, the chat is exploding with questions, and they are more or less related to the power of the state to grant rights, and the power of citizens to ask for those rights, and what do we do in cases where informal urbanization, slums, is the prevalent form of urbanization. Yeah. So I think we have a lot of people, just a parenthesis here, we have a lot of people from all over the world, and I think it's interesting to think of very different realities here.
Yeah.
So
Agree. And so that was like the case so when I was rapporteur, I went on country visits, 2 formal country visits a year. And in both Nigeria and Egypt, I was lucky to go to those 2 countries. Those are super important in terms of housing, obviously in the global south. Nigeria, as you may know, is the country with the greatest number of people living in extreme poverty in the world, even though it's the 29th largest economy in the world. So an oil producing country with extreme poverty, one of these horrible examples. And also a country with many, many, many vacant homes. So homelessness, informal settlements is where the bulk of the population lives, and empty middle-class homes sitting there, not used. My suggestion around informal settlements is that, governments have very clear human rights obligations in this area, and I wrote an entire report about this. So under the Sustainable Development Goals, governments are required to upgrade informal settlements, and that means ensuring they have access to basic services. And it means more than that. It means what we use the term regularizing. It's not a nice term, but informal settlements should be regularized where the inhabitants want their community to be regularized. That means they should be allowed to stay put. They should be given long-term security of tenure. That could look different in different places. Security of tenure means just generally that you shouldn't be fearing eviction, that you wouldn't be able to just be removed from the lands upon which you're living and the homes in which you're living. And so access to basic services, security of tenure, long-term and intergenerational, an ability to stay put if communities want, and if communities don't want, because often communities are setting up on the side of a railroad track, or they're in a toxic waste dump, they have the right to be relocated somewhere close by into long-term adequate housing. And so those are human rights obligations on states, and governments know that. It's just they're not always acting that way. I think the pandemic has been useful. I think the pandemic has shown that at least informal settlements need access to basic services.
And they are completely unsustainable. In case of a new pandemic, for example, people will get infected.
Exactly.
I just wanted to highlight one thing that might shock you guys all over the world, and is that citizens in informal settlements, they are citizens many times, just like all other citizens. So they in principle, so in theory, they should have rights, right? And one of the big problems is that we are not educated in our architectural schools to look at these people as citizens, right? We look at them as very separate from us, and I think that's a huge problem. I don't know if I make sense. There are quite a lot of more questions. Carolina is asking, cities are engines of the economy and should have more decision power. Oftentimes cities are faster and more flexible, but they would become stronger, what would be the role of rural areas? Won't the rural inhabitants become marginalized? She's asking.
I'm sorry, say again the question. What would be the role of rural, in what context?
I imagine in the context of this talk, for example, we are only talking about how cities are engines of development. And I think Carolina is worried about leaving the rural areas behind.
Yeah, no, and that's such an important point. When I was in India, another place I did a mission, when I think about it, I was so lucky. India, Nigeria, and Egypt. I mean, there are 3 big ones. But in India, you'd be surprised, because though the world is generally urbanizing at a very rapid rate, that is not true of India. So they have a huge percentage of their population still living in rural areas. And it is absolutely vital that we not ignore those living. I mean, India is just one country. It would be true that every country has people living in rural areas, and we have to make sure that those living in rural areas have what they need to stay there if that's what they want to do. And that's often the problem. What we're seeing is rural areas are not having, we live in times where young people now all want access to things like cell phones and internet. And I mean, even if they're living rurally, they expect these things. And so we need to somehow figure out a way to ensure that rural areas have the access to services that they need. I mean, in some of the communities in India that I went to, I mean, in the rural areas, I mean, the access to services was just not there, you know, toilets, potable drink water that could be, that you can drink. These are basic things, let alone internet access, et cetera, for connectivity issues. So I think that's right. And the other issue is having proper transportation between rural areas, and maybe not, it doesn't always have to be a city center, but some other larger center. Some rural people living in rural areas don't have a mechanism or a means, for example, if they're agriculturalists, to actually share the benefits of their agriculture with other communities if they don't have access to transportation, for example. So totally agree that you can't, we can't have a discussion only about cities. And I'll just add one more thing. I haven't mentioned Indigenous peoples, but I wrote a report on Indigenous peoples and the right to housing. And one of the things I learned, actually, I sort of knew it before, but I really learned it, is there isn't quite the same sense of urbanization amongst Indigenous populations. They have a much more back and forth kind of existence. So they go urban when necessary, they go back to their rural lands when necessary, and sort of this. So we need to sort of better understand those flows and what those people need to make that kind of reality work for them.
Chris has a very sharp question. Are there any countries doing it well, and what can we learn from them?
Doing what well? Anything?
Doing what well?
Well, I mean, it depends on the issue. And of course, there are little micro, amazing things happening all around the world, actually. So, if I take the issue of homelessness, we tend to look at Finland. That is the only country in Europe, in fact, maybe the only country in the world that's really actually genuinely reducing homelessness. They're on track for ending it by 2027 at the latest. I think they're actually ahead of their own targets. I can look at South Africa, for example, that has in its constitution a justiciable right to housing. In other words, you can actually go to court and say if you feel the government is denying you the right to housing, and make a legal claim. Not every country you can do that in. So that would be, we could discuss whether the cases coming out are good or bad or not, but nevertheless, they actually have that articulated right in a really meaningful way. There are really interesting taxation laws in Singapore, for example, around the financialization of housing. So that haven't quite curbed financialization, but they've certainly enabled the two systems to exist in Singapore. Social housing exists right alongside the financialization of housing in that district. So yes, there are plenty of examples. What I'm not seeing enough of, in my opinion, is, and I should have said, local governments are doing all sorts of interesting things. Keep your eye on Berlin and Barcelona. They're doing really interesting things. Amsterdam, there's been some really interesting city level initiatives around Airbnb, for example. So, there's some cool things happening. But I'd really like to see governments really pivot more toward legislating the right to housing and developing strategies that are based in a human rights framework. And I am working with, I just got off the phone, believe it or not, with the state of Connecticut, of all places, Connecticut, where they're asking me, we want law on the right to housing. What should it look like? So it's happening everywhere. We just have to that's part of the idea of the shift as a global movement, is for me. And I've been derailed by COVID a little bit, but we want to start as the shift, exposing all the ways the right to housing is being implemented globally, so that we can all feel we're part of a global movement.
There are quite a few questions. The chat box is exploding. Martin, you had a quite elaborate question. Could you just say it, or maybe I can?
Yeah, I'm happy to say. I mean, I really admire your optimism because what you're trying to achieve is, well, very difficult. I wouldn't say impossible, but very difficult. But what's bugging me is that you're rowing against the stream, where inequality globally is increasing quite rapidly in terms of wealth and in terms of income. Yeah. Which means that the opportunities of people to access housing and to access housing in good locations is becoming increasingly unequal, and we see this everywhere in the world. So, how, in my view, it's already a major task to make sure that things will not get worse from here on. So, how to make this extra step to actually improve the housing situation of many people? What can you do?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, Martin, totally. I mean, the other day, I think it was this weekend, I started to think, I don't let myself do it too often, but I was just thinking, like, do I really think that I, even in conjunction with many others, because we are many, can change these systems? Yeah. And there are days when I think, of course not, it's impossible. And then there are other days when I think, you know what, it's probably better not to ask that question and just keep trying to chip away. So I admit that that's just a personal reflection on what it's like to be an advocate when you've decided to bite off this piece. I do feel that there is so much brewing at the local level, so many amazing actions at the local level. If we could just unite it somehow, harness it as a global movement, the way climate changers have managed to come together in some respects, maybe we have a chance. I'm not sure, to be honest, but I do derive a lot of energy from what I see happening on the ground. You know, whether it's like a couple of weeks ago, I woke up and I saw this story that in Brooklyn, tenants had gone to the local court where all these eviction proceedings happen, and they literally put locks around the doors of the court because, you know, on the premise that these evictions were happening contrary to eviction moratoriums in the midst of a pandemic and blah blah blah. And when I see these actions, I mean, that's just one teeny thing. People have taken to the streets in Cape Town and so many places, occupying buildings, in Berlin, demanding the expropriation of buildings and really trying to get that into legislation. And there's so many in Jakarta, a community that was evicted, used the fact that they were many in number during an election to gain sort of political leverage. So the community that had been evicted agreed to back a certain politician if that politician would commit to allowing them to rebuild on the site where they were and to receive resources to do so. He agreed, he got reelected, and now the community is being built up. So there's all these things happening that make me feel hopeful, I guess, Martin, is what I would say.
I always reply when people ask me a similar question is, well, doing nothing would make things a lot worse. So you need to do something.
That's right.
But then how I mean, money buys choice. If you have a high income, you can choose where to live. If you don't have any income or a very low income, then your choices are very limited.
Yeah.
So our housing market is very much market driven. It's driven by and the way the cities are changing is driven by those with choice and hence income.
Yes,
So
absolutely. And
how
I mean,
can
that's
you
what I'm
change that?
trying. Well, I'm trying to encourage city level governments and national level governments to legislate in ways and adopt policies that would curb that from happening any further. So, for example, one of the things I have been suggesting during this pandemic is the right of first refusal for cities and national level governments, so that when assets become available, cities and national level governments could have the right to put a bid on that property first and bring those properties into their public asset portfolio. And from there, they can decide what to do with that asset. So they might then work with a community housing association to roll that out as social housing and deeply affordable housing. That to me is that's my only interest in this. It's not to now enable them to turn it into luxury, obviously. So encouraging governments to try to come up with ways to increase public assets and curb speculation, to get in the way of the speculators. You can even just do that by increasing tenant protections. If you said in a nation, okay, I mean, this works in developed countries where they have landlord-tenant law intact, et cetera. And you just said, okay, from now on, rent freeze for 5 years, not dissimilar from the way mortgages work, but rent freeze for 5 years, and no new units, any new units that are built, a certain percentage must be social, a certain percentage must be deeply affordable. Then you're getting different kinds of investors interested in your city, right? And that might curb this horrible speculation that's happening. Sorry, I'm talking fast and I'm conscious of the time.
Thank you very much.
But Martin, we should remain in conversation, please.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm so interested in your work.
I already took the liberty to give your email address to him.
Please do. Let's have a conversation sometime for sure.
Althea, would you like to say your question, or should I read it? How does pricing based on demand and supply inform this human rights framework for housing?
Right. I'm sorry, Robert.
Yeah.
I was trying to
unmute.
let me introduce myself. Thea Sherman. I'm from Morgan State, and the reason why I'm asking this question is because most of these cities, right, exist within the framework of capitalism, and as we know, the pricing in a capitalistic framework is also driven by demand and supply, right? All things being equal, if you got more people going after limited resources, demand, I mean, that will also inform the price. And so that's the question I'm asking. How does that inform this framework, this human rights framework? Are you including or considering that? You know, you got all these people, you use Lagos as an example, flocking into a city, and there are limited resources, there are limited housing. How do you manage that in your human rights framework? Is the question. Yeah,
and I mean, the supply demand stuff is complicated I actually only have a few minutes, I think. But to say that it's not as straightforward as people make it seem. So who is creating what demand? We have to ask, okay? So, and is it real demand? So, okay, I'll take the city of Toronto as an easy example. If anyone walk into the city of Toronto, get to the city of Toronto, you will go downtown and you'll look and you'll see, oh my God, it's like crazy, the number of sky-rise condominium, so many, and they've all sprung up since the global financial crisis, okay? Building after building, and they're huge, 50 stories, 60 stories, they're massive buildings. Well, who wanted those condos? Who's buying those condos? Investors.
Yeah, I understand that, but you use in the context of a developing country like Lagos. I'm originally from Liberia, by the way.
Right.
And so there's, we've got to make sure we make these contexts.
But the same thing
framework can be applied holistically depending on.
But the same is in Lagos. I walk through neighborhoods in Actually, we didn't, I wasn't even allowed to walk. I was driving through many neighborhoods in Lagos.
I'm sure you were.
And what did I see? House after house after house, very beautiful, nice middle-class homes, and no one living there. Who is driving that? That's not the demand. More than, well, 50% of the population is living in extreme poverty, and I think 60% in informal settlements, and it was higher than that. And so the demand is actually for basic housing, not middle-class housing. That's where the bulk of the demand is. It's that the supply is not meeting demand. What's being built is not meeting who needs housing, right? What's being built is supply is being dictated by money, as Martin was talking about. And so that's the equation is all askew. That's why I said it's too difficult to talk about in just a few minutes.
Yeah, right.
But
exactly.
the human rights framework takes that very seriously. And we do not, in my analysis is not that we have almost anywhere a supply issue. I mean, it's not totally true, but the issue is what kind of supply we have. I mean, even in Lagos, what's being built, and in Cairo and etc. And in all parts of India, luxury stuff is being built. Who is that for? And short-term rentals. I mean, they're building for short-term rentals, including in developing countries. What is that about, right?
So that's the question I was asking. Does your framework consider those factors?
Absolutely, it has to.
Demand.
Yeah.
And also another factor is everyone's going to the city. You know, I know this would be an issue in developing countries. So that's disruptive to the economy as well. Everyone wants to go to the city. And so you don't have the rest of the countries being developed. But that's another conversation for another
conversation. I'm afraid
right,
we are very
but
short.
thank you for taking my question. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Althea. Thanks a lot. Guys, we have reached the end of our interaction with Leilani, I'm afraid. I'm very sorry. And there are several questions that will remain unanswered for the moment, but I hope they will be answered in time as we discuss more and more. Leilani, on behalf of the Delft University of Technology, I have to thank you so much for your great participation today and for enlightening us about the right to housing. And this conversation will continue with our manifesto for the just city that we are inviting people to write, and copies will certainly be sent to you. Guys, virtual round of applause to Leilani. Thank you so much. And now, well, I am going to interrupt our streaming of the event, and we are going to have a 10-minute break. And for those who are involved with the call for the manifesto for the Just City, we invite you to stay half an hour longer after the 10 minutes so that we can do an exercise and explain a little bit better to you what we are aiming for, right? So with this manifesto. It's amazing. We have more than 20 universities here present today. And I think lots of interesting conversations may arise. As we saw in the chat, there are very different conceptions of the role of the state, what the state should do, what should the market do, is housing a right? And if it's a right, how can we fulfill this right to all citizens? So without further ado, we are going to have a 10-minute break from now. So let me see, it's 7:10. We are going to come back at 20 past 7 for those who are involved with the call. And I just ask you a little bit of energy because I know it's a long activity, but please be there, come back in 10 minutes and we will discuss. See you.